I've been hiking backcountry trails for 15 years, and I've never felt truly lost until that day. Not the normal kind of lost. The kind where someone wants you to be lost. The morning started like any other solo trek. I'd parked my Subaru at the Clearwater Creek trailhead, double-checked my pack, and logged my route with the ranger station. The September air had that perfect crispness that makes you feel alive, and the aspens were just starting to turn golden. I'd planned a 3-day loop through some of Montana's more remote terrain, something I'd done dozens of times before. I always mark my trails, even on well-established paths. It's a habit I picked up after a close call in Colorado years ago. Every half mile or so, I'd tie a small piece of bright orange surveyor's tape, the kind that stands out against forest green but degrades naturally after a few weeks. Some might call it excessive, but those markers had saved my bacon more than once when weather rolled in. The first sign something was wrong came around mid-afternoon. I'd stopped for water and a quick energy bar when I noticed one of my markers seemed off. Instead of pointing along my intended route, it was now directing me down a game trail I'd specifically avoided. I frowned, pulled out my map, and checked my coordinates. Everything else matched up, but that marker was definitely moved. Probably just an animal, I muttered to myself, reading it correctly. But something felt wrong. The knot I'd found wasn't random. It was tied in exactly the same way I tie mine, just oriented in a different direction. I pushed on, but now I was paying closer attention. An hour later, I found another marker changed. Then another. Someone was following my path and systematically altering my trail markers. Each one was redirected to lead deeper into the dense forest, away from the main trail and my planned route. My pace quickened as I checked my phone. No service, as expected is deep in the backcountry. The GPS still worked, but the battery was down to 40%. I had my backup battery, but even that would only last so long. The smart move would be to turn back, but the thought of retracing my steps toward whoever was behind me sent a chill down my spine. That's when I heard it, the first distinct snap of a branch from the thick brush parallel to the trail. I stopped dead, listening. Nothing. Then another crack, closer this time. Someone was keeping pace with me just out of sight. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello? Is someone there?" The forest answered with silence. That unnatural silence when everything goes still at once. Dropping all pretense of normal hiking, I picked up my pace significantly. The footsteps in the brush matched my speed. I could hear them clearly now. An experienced woods person, moving quietly but not quite quietly enough. They were hurting me, I realized. Every change marker, every parallel step was pushing me toward something. The sun was getting low, painting the forest in long shadows that seemed to reach for me like fingers. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and my options were running out with the light. The GPS showed I'd been slowly but surely pushed northeast of my intended path, despite my best efforts to compensate. Another branch snapped, this time behind me, then another to my left. More than one set of footsteps now. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I knew setting up camp was suicide. I'd be trapped in a tent while they had all night to wait me out. I reached for my emergency whistle, the sharp metallic taste of fear in my mouth. 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for help. The sound pierced the forest silence, and for a moment, everything stopped. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. Then I heard it, another whistle, answering mine. But it wasn't 3 blasts. It was 2 long ones, a pattern I'd never heard before. Then another set of 2 from a different direction. They were using my distress signal to coordinate. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on the markers and the follower that I'd walked right into their trap. The change markers weren't random. They were funneling me into a dead end. I pulled out my map with shaking hands, trying to get my bearings in the failing light. There was a ranger station marked about 4 miles south, for miles through increasingly dark forest, but it was my only chance. I took a deep breath, gripped my trekking poles tighter, and did the last thing they'd expect. I plunged straight off the trail into the brush, moving as fast as I safely could while still trying to be quiet. Behind me, I heard urgent whispers and the sudden movement of multiple people abandoning stealth for speed. What followed was the most intense cross-country hiking I've ever done. Every survival skill, every navigation trick, every bit of stamina I had went into that desperate race through the darkening woods. I crossed streams to break my trail, used fallen trees as bridges to avoid leaving prints, and kept the North Star on my right shoulder as I pushed south. The sounds of pursuit faded and returned, faded and returned. They knew these woods better than me, but I had desperation on my side. My legs were on fire, my lungs burning, but I didn't dare stop. The last light was nearly gone when I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart leap. The metal reflection of a bear box, the kind they keep at ranger stations. I broke through the tree lane into the station clearing, just as the first flashlight beam cut through the darkness behind me. The sight of the ranger's truck parked outside was the sweetest thing I'd ever seen. I hit the steps at a run, pounding on the door with my fist. The door opened to reveal a startled ranger, hand on his sidearm. Behind me, the woods had gone completely silent. When the police arrived an hour later, they found multiple sets of tracks around my altered trail markers, but no other signs of my stalkers. I never did find out who they were or what they wanted. The rangers said they'd had reports of stolen camping gear and missing hikers over the past few months, but nothing concrete. They stepped up patrols in the area, but I still think about those whistle signals sometimes, and how coordinated they were, how practiced. These days, I still hike, still mark my trails, but I carry a satellite phone and I never go alone. Sometimes, on quiet nights around the campfire, I think about how close I came to becoming another missing hiker statistic. To this day, I can't hear a whistle in the woods without remembering those two long blasts, calling to each other through the darkening forest, hunting me. The thing about being a landscape photographer is that you're trained to notice details. Every shadow, every shift in light, every subtle change in composition. Maybe that's why I noticed him before anyone else would have. I just wish I hadn't. I was 3 days into a week-long photography trip through Glacier National Park, documenting the changing seasons for my portfolio. September brings the most dramatic light to the mountains, when the sun hits the peaks at just the right angle to make them glow like they're on fire. My Canon R5 was getting a workout, and my memory cards were filling up with what I hoped would be my best work yet. The first photo where I spotted him was from Hidden Lake Overlook. I almost missed it. Just a tiny figure in faded gear, standing near a cluster of pines, barely visible against the shadowed mountainside. I only noticed because I was checking my focus points at full zoom on my laptop that evening in my tent. There was something off about his stance, the way he was positioned. He wasn't taking in a view like the other distant hikers in my shots. He was facing my direction. I wouldn't have thought twice about it if I hadn't seen him again the next morning, 12 miles away at Iceberg Lake. Same outfit. What looked like old-school external frame pack, faded olive hiking clothes that seemed somehow out of date. This time he was closer, maybe 100 yards behind where I'd been standing. Again, facing my position. My hand shook slightly as I flipped through the day's photos. There he was at Grinnell Glacier, half hidden behind a boulder. Then again at Avalanche Lake, standing in thigh-deep water, that oversized pack still on his shoulders. Each time closer, each time oriented toward my exact position when I took the shot. "You're freaking yourself out," I muttered, closing my laptop. But I double-checked my tent zippers before trying to sleep that night. The wind picked up, making the nylon walls shudder, and every sound had me straining to listen. I kept thinking about that figure, standing in the frigid lake water fully clothed, and how wrong it looked. The next morning, I forced myself to stick to my shooting schedule. The light was too perfect to waste, and I had clients waiting for these shots. But I found myself checking every frame obsessively, zooming in to scan the backgrounds. Nothing in my sunrise shots. Nothing at the first two locations. I started to relax, telling myself I'd imagine the pattern. Then I checked my shots from going to the Sun Road. He was there, 50 yards away now, standing on an outcropping that I could have sworn was empty when I took the photo. The resolution was sharp enough this time that I could make out details I wished I hadn't. His gear wasn't just old school, it was ancient. The kind of canvas rucksack and wool clothing you'd see in photos from the 1960s. And his face. The image was slightly blurred, but something was wrong with the proportions. Like looking at a reflection in disturbed water. My hands were steady as I packed up my gear, photographer's instincts taking over. I kept shooting through the day, but now I was documenting something else entirely. Every location, every angle showed him closer. The timestamps on the photos showed him covering impossible distances between shots. No one could move that fast through this terrain. At Bowman Lake, I finally saw him with my naked eye. Just a glimpse. A figure moving between trees on the opposite shore. That distinctive gait and oversized pack unmistakable. I raised my camera on pure reflex and fired off 3 shots in rapid succession. When I checked the LCD screen, he was in none of them. But he was in the next set I took, now on my side of the lake. I broke every rule of landscape photography and hiked out in the middle of golden hour. The ranger station was 5 miles away, and I covered it in record time. The young ranger at the desk looked concerned as I connected my laptop and started showing her the progression of photos. "Sir," she said slowly, "when exactly did you start this trip?" I told her the date. She went pale. "That's not possible. The trails you're showing, Grinnell, Hidden Lake, Bowman, they've been closed for maintenance all week. We haven't allowed any hikers through those areas for days." We went through the photos again. Every background hiker, every distant figure was clearly visible, except him. Where I'd seen him in the images, there were now just empty spaces. All except the last photo I'd taken, the one where he was closest. That one showed a familiar canvas rucksack, weathered and stained, half hidden under a fallen tree. The ranger recognized it immediately. It matched the description of gear carried by a photographer who disappeared in the park in 1963. They never found him, but they found some of his camera equipment scattered along the trails I'd been shooting. The case had gone cold decades ago. I spent 2 hours giving a statement to park police. They sent patrols to check the locations in my photos, but of course they found nothing. I offered to send them the images, but when I checked my memory cards later that night from the safety of my hotel room, every single photo from the trip was corrupted. All except one, the last shot of that abandoned rucksack. When I zoomed in close, I could just make out the faded initials carved into the leather straps. They matched my own. I still take photos, still shoot landscapes, but never in Glacier and never alone. Sometimes, when I'm editing late at night, I catch myself checking the backgrounds of my shots a little too carefully, looking for that figure in the distance, with his vintage gear and wrong-looking face. Part of me wants to know what the final photo would have shown if I'd stayed just a little longer, if I'd let him get a little closer. But the bigger part of me knows that somewhere in those mountains, there's a canvas rucksack with my initials waiting to be found. And sometimes, when the light hits the peaks just right, I swear I can see a familiar figure moving between the trees, getting closer one frame at a time. My grandfather used to say that the true stories are always scarier than anything you can make up. I never really believed him until I found those lines in the woods. Now I can't stop thinking about what they were pointing to and why. I picked Cedar Grove Campground because it was off-season and I needed solitude. October in the Pacific Northwest means rain, but the old growth forest canopy keeps the worst of it off your tent if you know where to set up. After my divorce, these solo camping trips became my therapy, cheaper than a shrink and just as effective. Usually, the first day was perfect. I had the entire primitive camping area to myself. Nothing but the sound of wind in the cedars and the distant rush of the river. I set up my site meticulously, It's a ritual that helps quiet my mind. Everything has its place. Camp stove aligned with my tent entrance, gear organized in weatherproof bags, headlamp and bear spray always in the same pocket. I noticed the first line when I got back from gathering firewood. 5 items from my campsite had been moved. My blue camp mug, a bag of trail mix, my compass, a spare tent stake, and my hiking boot brush. They were arranged in a perfectly straight line, pointing into the densest part of the forest. At first, I thought it was wind or maybe animals, but the precision was unsettling. Each item was exactly spaced, oriented in the same direction. "Hello," I called out, feeling foolish. "Someone there?" The forest absorbed my voice like it was hungry for it. I took photos of the line with my phone, then returned everything to its proper place. My hands were steady, but my heart was doing double time. I spent the next hour convinced someone was watching from the tree line, but the light faded without incident. That night, I barely slept. Every snapping twig had me sitting up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear movement outside. The rain started around midnight, a soft patter on the tent fly that should have been soothing, but just made it harder to distinguish sounds. Dawn brought heavy fog and another line. This time it was different items. My camp soap, a tent peg, my spork, a carabiner, and my backup lighter. The line pointed in a different direction, but with the same eerie precision. When I laid my map over the 2 lines, they intersected at a point about half a mile into the woods. I should have packed up right then, should have hiked out and reported it to the rangers. Instead, I found myself staring at that intersection point on the map, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The ranger station was a 2-hour hike away, and my pride didn't want to admit I was spooked by what could be an elaborate prank. I spent the day hiking nearby trails, taking photos of landmarks and checking my GPS coordinates obsessively. No cell service, but I had a satellite beacon for emergencies. Every time I returned to camp, I did a careful inventory. Nothing else moved. By late afternoon, I had almost convinced myself I was overreacting. Then I found the 3rd line. I'd been gone less than 20 minutes, just long enough to filter water from the creek. This time, they'd used 5 more items. My multi-tool, a stuffed sack, my camp towel, a fuel canister, and my backup battery pack. Another perfect line, pointing to a different section of forest. When I checked the map, all 3 lines intersected at exactly the same point. My hands were shaking as I marked the spot on my GPS. The coordinates put it in a section of old-growth forest where the contour lines bunched together tightly, indicating steep terrain. No trails led there. The fog had thickened, turning the forest beyond my camp into a gray wall. The smart move was to leave. I knew that. But something about those precise lines, the deliberate placement, the mathematical certainty of that intersection. I had to know. I packed light, just water, my satellite beacon, and my camera. The fog seemed to get denser as I followed my GPS, turning the massive cedars into looming shadows. The ground grew steeper, forcing me to grab tree trunks for balance. Moss made everything slick, and the silence was absolute except for my own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the canopy. The GPS showed me getting closer to the intersection point. 50 yards, 30, 20. The trees started to thin out, revealing what looked like a small clearing ahead. 10 yards. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hold the GPS steady. I almost missed it at first, just a dark space between 2 massive cedar trunks, partially hidden by a fallen nurse log. But as I got closer, I realized I was looking at the entrance to a cave, not a natural one. The opening was too regular, the walls too smooth. Old timber supports lined the entrance, rotted but still standing. An abandoned mine shaft. Had to be, but it wasn't on any of my maps. Something caught my eye near the entrance, a glint of metal half buried in the moss. I brushed it off with trembling fingers and found myself holding an old camp mug, the kind they made in the 70s. Then I noticed more items scattered around the entrance. Torn tent fabric, rusted camping gear, a broken compass exactly like mine. That's when I heard it, movement from inside the shaft, a scraping sound like something being dragged, and voices, just at the edge of hearing, speaking too quietly to make out words. I ran. I'd like to say I made a strategic retreat, but no, I flat out ran. Somehow made it back to camp without breaking an ankle, threw everything into my pack without bothering to organize it, and hiked out in the dark with my headlamp bouncing off fog. The Rangers found the mine shaft 2 days later. They said it was part of an abandoned copper operation, officially closed in 1973. They also found evidence of recent activity, fresh boot prints, food wrappers, and signs that someone had been living there. But they wouldn't tell me what else they found, just thanked me for the report, and suggested I pick a different campground next time. I've tried researching the area since then, found some old newspaper articles about missing hikers over the years. Most were never found, but in every case where they recovered any gear, it was arranged in straight lines pointing toward that same section of forest. Sometimes I wonder about those voices in the mine shaft, about who or what was so carefully arranging those lines, leading me there. But mostly I wonder about all the other campers who followed similar lines and never came back to tell their story. I still camp solo sometimes, still need that solitude, but now I photograph my campsite every time I leave it, checking each picture carefully for any signs that something's been moved. And if I ever find another line of my gear pointing into the woods, well, this time I'll be hiking in the opposite direction. When you spend enough nights in the woods, you learn that the scariest things aren't the bears or the wolves. It's the traces of people who don't want to be seen. Jake and I discovered that during our week-long trip to Olympic National Forest, where someone was building something with our firewood. Something big. We'd planned this backcountry camping trip for months, picking the remote Spider Lake site specifically because it rarely saw visitors this late in the season. The ranger had warned us about the unseasonably cold weather, but we were experienced enough to handle it, or so we thought. The first 2 days were perfect. Crisp October air, golden sunlight filtering through towering Douglas firs, and absolute solitude. We'd hauled in enough supplies for 10 days, including a decent stockpile of firewood we'd gathered and split that first afternoon. Jake was meticulous about stacking it, keeping a precise count for our evening fires. 36 pieces on that first night, which should have left us with exactly 208. I noticed a discrepancy during our third morning. "Hey, Jake, did you use any wood last night after I crashed?" He looked up from his coffee. "Nah, why? Could have sworn we had more splits than this." I counted again. 196 pieces. 12 missing. We double-checked our count, thinking we'd made a mistake. But Jake's obsessive organization meant we knew exactly how much we'd started with. Someone or something had taken 12 pieces of our firewood during the night. Probably raccoons, Jake suggested, but we both knew that made no sense. The pieces were heavy, split oak and maple, and raccoons don't stack wood. We found the missing pieces that afternoon, about 50 yards into the forest. They were arranged in what looked like the beginning of a square foundation, each piece perfectly aligned with the others. The precision was unnerving. This wasn't random animal activity or another camper borrowing wood. This was deliberate construction. We photographed it, debated reporting it, but ultimately decided we were being paranoid. We left the wood there, curious to see if anything would change. Big mistake. That night, we lost 20 more pieces. The temperature dropped below freezing, and we had to dip deeper into our supply than planned. When we checked the site in the morning, the foundation had grown. More concerning were the vertical pieces now standing at each corner, braced with smaller splits. "It's like they're building a shelter," Jake muttered, keeping his voice low despite being an open forest. But who builds at night? In freezing weather? We never saw anyone, never heard traditional construction sounds. But each morning, more of our wood would be missing, and that structure would be bigger, more complex. By the 5th day, It stood chest-high, with an intricate pattern of cross beams that seemed to defy physics. All assembled without nails or rope, just precise pressure points and gravity. The ranger station was a day's hike out, and our satellite phone was dead despite having charged it the day before. We started keeping watch in shifts at night, but somehow the wood still disappeared. Even when we were staring right at the pile, pieces would go missing. We'd turn to check a sound, and when we looked back, another split would be gone. On the sixth night, it snowed. We huddled around our dwindling fire, watching our breath crystallize in the beam of our headlamps. The sound came around 3 a.m., not construction noise, but a low humming, rhythmic, almost musical, but just wrong enough to make your teeth ache. Jake grabbed my arm. Look, through the falling snow, dark figures moved between the trees. They were tall, too tall to be human, but moved with deliberate purpose. We counted 5, then 7, then lost track as they wove between the trunks. The humming grew louder, and our fire dimmed despite having just fed it. We sat paralyzed, watching as our remaining firewood began to move, not dragged or carried. The pieces simply slid across the ground as if pulled by invisible strings, all moving toward that structure in the woods. The hum reached a pitch that made my ears pop, and then everything went silent. When we finally worked up the courage to look, the structure had changed. No longer a simple shelter. It now resembled something like a tower, spiraling up into the canopy. Our entire wood supply had been incorporated into it, but what turned our blood cold were the spaces we could now see built into it. Spaces that looked disturbingly like doors, all sealed except for one. Jake snapped. He grabbed his flashlight and started toward it. I tried to stop him, but he was convinced we needed to end this mystery. He made it halfway there before the humming started again. I've never seen anyone run so fast. We abandoned half our gear, taking only what we could grab quickly, and hiked out in the dark. Hypothermia seemed a better risk than staying another minute. The Rangers found our campsite empty the next day. Our abandoned gear was there, but they reported no structure, no tower, not even scattered firewood. Just a perfect circle of dead grass and frozen soil 50 yards into the forest, 15 feet in diameter. We filed a report, but what could we say? That invisible beings stole our firewood to build an impossible tower? That something had been constructing a doorway in the middle of Olympic National Forest? The strangest part came 3 weeks later. A research station in the area reported unusual seismic activity on the night we left. Rhythmic vibrations that their instruments couldn't properly classify. The epicenter was exactly where we'd camped. I still backpack, still camp in remote places, but I carry a gas stove now. No more firewood. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind moves through trees, I think I hear that humming again. And I wonder how many other campers have contributed their firewood to whatever's being built in those dark spaces between the trees. Jake won't camp anymore. Says he keeps dreaming about that open doorway in the tower. In his dreams, he walks through it. He won't tell me what he sees on the other side, but he wakes up counting in a language I don't recognize. Last week, I got a package from the ranger station. Inside was a single piece of split oak, one I recognized from our pile. On one side, carved with impossible precision, is a series of lines that look almost like blueprints. Every night since then, I've found my backyard firewood rearranged in the morning, just slightly, just enough to make me wonder if something is getting ready to build again. They say you should trust your instincts when you're alone in the wilderness. The problem is, sometimes your instincts tell you something so impossible that trusting them feels crazier than ignoring them. That's what I kept telling myself about my tent zippers, right up until the last night. I'd chosen a remote spot in the Gila wilderness for my week of solitude, a necessary break after a brutal year at work. No cell service, no other campers, just me in the desert mountains of New Mexico. The first thing you learn about solo camping is to be meticulous about security. Every zipper closed fully, every piece of gear accounted for, every sound investigated. That's why I noticed it the first morning. Both zippers on my tent door were stopped about 3 inches from the top. Not a huge gap, but definitely not where I'd left them the night before. I distinctly remembered zipping them all the way up, hearing that satisfying click of the poles meeting at the top. Wind must have vibrated them down, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But these were quality YKK zippers, tight enough that you had to pull with purpose to move them. They didn't just slide down on their own. I marked their exact position with tiny pieces of masking tape, precise little arrows showing where each zipper stop should be. That night, I made a point of filming myself closing them completely with my phone's camera. I even tugged on them to demonstrate how much force it took to move them. Sleep didn't come easily. Every whisper of wind against the tent had me straining to hear the subtle sound of a zipper moving. I finally drifted off around midnight, my camp knife close at hand. Morning showed both zippers 3 inches down again. Exactly 3 inches. I checked my tape markers. They hadn't been disturbed. The zippers had somehow moved without breaking or disturbing the tape. I spent that day hiking, trying to clear my head and think rationally. No tracks around my tent. No sign of disturbance. The area was too rocky for footprints anyway. When I returned, I set up a more elaborate test. I ran a thin thread between the zipper poles, the kind of sewing thread that would break if the zippers separated. Then I placed a line of fine sand along the tent threshold. Finally, I set up my phone to record time-lapse video of the door all night. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset. I huddled in my sleeping bag, watching the tent door silhouetted against the stars through the mesh window. Nothing moved. The thread stayed intact. Around 2 a.m., I finally let myself drift off. Morning brought the same result. Zippers down 3 inches, but the thread was unbroken. The sand line was undisturbed. And the video? It showed nothing. The zippers appeared down in the first frame of daylight, with no footage of them moving during the night. My rational mind began constructing increasingly elaborate explanations. Temperature changes affecting the tent material. Some kind of optical illusion. Maybe I was sleepwalking. But none of these explain how the zippers move without breaking the thread or disturbing the sand. On the 4th night, I decided to stay awake. No matter what, I would watch those zippers all night. I made coffee, positioned my headlamp, and settled in for my vigil. The hours crept by. Moonlight shifted across the tent walls. My eyes burned from staring at the door. At some point, I must have dozed for just a moment. When my eyes snapped open, the zippers were down, 3 inches exactly, the thread intact, the sand undisturbed. But this time, something was different. There was a smell in the tent, like ozone after a lightning strike, but mixed with something else, something organic, and the air felt wrong, like the pressure had changed. I reached for my phone to check the time. The screen was dead, so was my backup battery pack. Even my watch had stopped at 3:33 a.m. That's when I heard it, not from outside the tent, but from the zippers themselves. A soft humming, barely audible but deeply wrong. The kind of sound that makes your fillings ache. I watched paralyzed as the zippers began to vibrate slightly, not moving up or down, just vibrating in place. The humming grew louder, and I swear the space around the zipper opening began to look distorted, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The gap seemed to widen without the zippers moving, as if the very fabric of the tent was being stretched by something I couldn't quite see. Then I saw the hand. Not a human hand. Not really a hand at all. Just something hand-shaped, reaching through that impossible gap. It was there and not there at the same time, like trying to look at a blind spot in your vision. The thread didn't break. The sand didn't move. But that thing was coming through. I like to say, I faced it bravely. That I stayed to see what it was, or tried to document it somehow. Instead, I burst out the back of my tent, cutting through the fabric with my knife. I ran without shoes, without direction, just away from that humming and that not hand reaching through an opening that couldn't exist. They found me the next morning on a Forest Service road, feet bloody from running on rocks. My tent was exactly as I'd left it, except the back was sliced open and both zippers were fully closed. The thread was still intact, the sand undisturbed. Even my phone and watch worked perfectly again. The Rangers were understanding but skeptical. They'd seen plenty of people spooked by the wilderness before. They helped me pack out, took my report, and probably had a good laugh about it later. But here's the thing. When I got home and really examined my gear, I found something I can't explain. On the inside of both zipper pulls, carved with microscopic precision, was a series of symbols I didn't recognize. When I tried to photograph them, they wouldn't show up in any picture. When I tried to draw them, my hand would shake uncontrollably. I sold all my camping gear after that. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that humming coming from my closet door. The zippers on my jackets will be down exactly 3 inches in the morning, no matter how many times I close them. And occasionally, just at the edge of sleep, I see something hand-shaped reaching through gaps that shouldn't exist, getting closer each time. I keep waiting for someone else to report something similar, to validate what I experienced. But maybe they can't. Maybe whatever comes through those impossible gaps makes sure there's no one left to talk about it. All I know is that I check every zipper in my house compulsively now, and I never, ever leave them 3 inches down. The sound from the abandoned mine started at exactly 3:27 a.m. every night, a rhythmic mechanical whirring that shouldn't have existed in a shaft that had been closed for 40 years. At first, we thought we were imagining it. By the end, we wish we had been. Our group of 4 had chosen the spot in the Cascades specifically because of its remoteness. As amateur geologists, we love camping near the old mining sites, collecting specimens and imagining the history. Mark had done the research, finding coordinates for the defunct Silver Creek mine that weren't on any recent maps. The ranger station had no record of it, which should have been our first warning. It's like it's been erased, Sarah said as we set up camp that first evening. The autumn air was crisp, and the sunset painted the mountain peaks in shades of purple and gold. We were about half a mile from where our GPS indicated the mine entrance should be. The first night passed quietly. Too quietly, really. No owls, no wind in the pines, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just that heavy silence you get before a storm. Except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It started on the second night. I was on last watch, tending the dying fire, when I heard it, a deep mechanical groaning, followed by rhythmic clanking, like old mining equipment coming to life. The sound echoed off the valley walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. "Guys," I hissed, waking the others. "Listen." We stood there in the darkness, headlamps off, just listening. The sound was getting louder, more organized. Machinery that hadn't run in decades was working with precise, purposeful movements. "That's impossible," Mark whispered, checking his watch. 3:27 a.m. We should check it out at first light. Dawn revealed a landscape transformed by fog, thick and unnatural for the season. We followed our GPS toward the mine coordinates, the mist curling around our boots. The entrance was exactly where it should have been. Timber support still standing despite decades of neglect. "Look at this," Sarah called, crouching near the entrance. Fresh marks scored the rock, like something heavy had been dragged in or out recently. And there were footprints in the mud, lots of them, all leading in. Our equipment detected no dangerous gas levels, so we cautiously entered. The main shaft was larger than expected, reinforced with modern support beams that couldn't have been more than a few months old. Our lights revealed fresh tool marks on the walls, power cables running deeper into the darkness. "Someone's been working in here," Tom said, examining a junction box. "Recently, but why at night? And why isn't this registered with the Forest Service?" We found our answer about 200 yards in. The shaft opened into a massive chamber that shouldn't have existed. The walls were lined with equipment I didn't recognize, not old mining gear, but something more advanced. Strange symbols were carved into the rock faces, Geometric patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. Guys, Mark's voice cracked. These readings don't make sense. His Geiger counter was registering impossible numbers, but not radiation. Something else. Something the device wasn't designed to measure. That's when we heard the whirring start up again, not echoing from the distance this time. We were in the source chamber. The machines around us began humming to life, displays flickering with those same shifting symbols. We ran. There's no shame in admitting it. But as we reached the main shaft, we saw them, dark figures moving through the mist, heading toward the entrance. They walked with an unnatural gait, carrying equipment that glowed faintly blue. One turned toward us, and under its hood, I still can't describe what I saw. It wasn't a face. It wasn't anything that should exist. We retreated deeper into the mine, finding a side tunnel to hide in. For hours, we listened to them work. The sounds were clearer now, not just machinery but voices. They spoke in something that might have been language, but it hurt our ears to listen too closely. When silence finally fell, we made our way out. The sun was setting again, and the fog had returned. Back at camp, we found our tent had been searched. Nothing was missing, but everything had been examined. Items arranged in strange geometric patterns that matched the symbols in the mine. That's when Tom noticed the missing persons posters he'd picked up from the ranger station. 3 hikers had vanished in this area over the past month. The dates of their disappearances all lined up with the new moon. We broke camp in record time. But as we hiked out, Sarah made a connection that chilled us to the bone. She'd been tracking the machinery sounds. They were getting longer each night. The first night was exactly 33 minutes. The second, 66 minutes. If the pattern held, on the night of the new moon, they would run for exactly 6 hours and 66 minutes. The new moon was tomorrow night. We made it back to civilization, but our story wasn't exactly welcomed. The Rangers found no evidence of recent activity in the mine. The support beams we'd seen were rotted and ancient. No modern equipment, no strange symbols. They did find some of the missing hikers' gear, though, arranged in precise geometric patterns. I tried to go back once, months later, with better equipment and a larger group. The mine entrance was completely collapsed, like it had been deliberately sealed. But at night, you can still hear it, that mechanical whirring, growing longer as each new moon approaches. The Forest Service has no record of our report. The missing hikers' cases were closed, marked as probable animal attacks. Even our photos came out blurred and distorted, showing nothing but an old, abandoned mine shaft. But sometimes on dark nights, my phone displays strange symbols instead of numbers. My compass spins wildly when pointed toward those mountains. And I keep finding small items in my house arranged in familiar geometric patterns, even though I live alone. Mark vanished 3 months ago, near another abandoned mine site. The police report notes the time of his last known contact, 3:27 a.m. Sarah's been documenting similar sites across the country, mapping them against disappearances. The pattern she's found is terrifying. The sites form their own geometric shape and the center point. Well, that's why I'm writing this down. Because tonight's the new moon, and those coordinates lead right to my backyard. The mechanical sound started at exactly 3:27 a.m., and they're getting closer. I can see figures moving through the fog outside my window. They're carrying something that glows blue, and they're building something in the darkness. One piece at a time, one missing person at a time. Something that, like those symbols in the mine, hurts to look at directly. Something that's almost ready.